Kevin Flaherty, 247 Sports, hell of a college basketball writer, joins us. Craig Smoak and Paul Catalina, David Smoak on 365 Sports. Kevin, I've used the word battering ram for the Big 12. Kansas has 5 losses. The winner of the conference might end up with, my goodness, 5 losses. I don't know. Is it even more competitive than you thought when the new 4 arrived and we saw this season about to start?
Yeah, I think so. You know, you always look at the cliche like any given night, right? And I think in the Big 12, typically that's been a little more realistic than in other leagues. There's usually, you know, a definite bottom team. You look at the SEC and Missouri doesn't have a win yet. Missouri is not, you know, beating the top team in the SEC on any given night. But you look in the Big 12 and you look at how deep it is 1 through 14. And there have been some real scares there. You know, obviously Baylor had a real scare with Oklahoma State. You know, there have been, Kansas has lost to UCF and West Virginia. And you look at the top of the league and there's a very real chance that those teams, you know, wind up playing some of those teams at the quote unquote bottom part of the league. And it's a very real area where they could lose. And one of the crazier things, I'm actually working on an article right now looking at the most efficient teams since January 1st. And for Big 12 teams, that means all of their games are in conference play. Kansas is the number 11 most efficient team since January 1st, and they're 7-5. And so I think that goes to tell you can be pretty much a top 10 team and still be sitting right around 500 in league play. That's how tough this league is.
Kansas's problems obviously start really with the bench in that they, for 2 years now, haven't really had a lot of depth there since the title. Where has Bill Self gone wrong with that? In addition to the fact that this year, I think it probably stems from Arterio Morris and the gigantic misstep of bringing him in.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail right on the head, and quite frankly, it's a nail that not a lot of people have hit on. You know, I think a lot of people have looked at the roster and said, well, Nick Timberlake hasn't quite been what they thought. You know, Marco Jackson was a McDonald's All-American that came in and was maybe a little bit more raw than people thought. But I think those things would have mostly been okay if Arterio Morris had come in and not had the issues that he had not gotten booted from the team. He would have filled a lot of the holes that they would have had. Johnny Furphy would have been a sixth man in that case. And all of a sudden your bench unit's looking quite a bit better. And instead of that, you know, Arterio Morris leaves. And so you're choosing between guys who maybe aren't quite as athletic, but are a little bit more skilled, or going the other way, going with a guy like Marco Jackson, who's a really good athlete, but still figuring out basketball at this level. And Arterio Morris was a guy that quite frankly had both. And so I think you have that, and then you have the injuries and illnesses that they've had. You know, what was it? I think 2 weeks ago, it seemed like Texas Tech had Ebola, and half their team was out. And you know, Kansas got hit by illness too. You know, Johnny Furphy was sick the day of the Kansas State game and only practiced once that entire week afterwards. He's coming back from that. Jamari McDowell has missed the last 2 games. With illness. Kevin McCullough's injury is obviously part of that. And so you take a team that really wasn't deep in the first place and you start, you know, sort of chopping holes on that roster. And they had 7 available scholarship players against Baylor and 7 scholarship players available 2 nights later against Texas Tech. And I think you saw the result of that. There were a lot of tired legs in Lubbock.
Kevin, Texas Tech, what a big win for them. I mean, you laid out the reasons why that game went the way that it did, but just in general, to get a banner win like that, a blowout win over KU is a big deal for Grant McCasland and company. They're 7-4 now at this point in the conference. Just having seen them progress throughout the year now under his guidance, what have stood out to you as the biggest impressions of the McCasland era early on in Lubbock?
Yeah, and let's be clear. If Kansas is full strength, Kansas wasn't winning that game. Texas Tech, you know, played that well. And Darian Williams, I'm not sure I've seen a player in the Big 12 play as efficiently as he did in terms of scoring 30 points and not missing a shot either from the field or from the free throw line, also grabbing 11 rebounds. And with him, you can't – one of the bad things about the transfer portal is you can't count on somebody sticking around anymore, right? You can't look and say, okay, this guy's a sophomore. We'll be really excited to have him as a junior because, either, hey, they play really well, they wind up testing the NBA waters and they're gone, or other people are going to make offers or things like that. But Texas Tech, generally speaking, has to be really excited with Williams' development as a sophomore and as a guy that, if he sticks around and Lubbock, could be a foundational piece and potentially an all Big 12 piece. And you add that to the backcourt that they've had, Pop Isaacs. I like watching him a lot. He's one of those guys that is kind of fun and that, I'm not sure he has a whole lot of a filter when he's out on the court in terms of, hey, this is not the moment for me to take a 30-footer, or this is not the moment for me to do this. That makes him a lot of fun. And when you pair him with a leader and an older guy like Joe Toussaint, who's a little more reined in and kind of has a little bit more sense of the moment, I think that backcourt's coming together really, really nicely. And then the big thing for them, the thing that's kind of told the story, I feel like, on their whole season is Warren Washington and the way that he's come along. Having that kind of center and a guy that can impact the game on both ends of the court, I think has really given them a foundational piece. He won't be up for all Big 12 honors, I don't think, this year, but he'll be a guy that if you talk to coaches around the league and say, hey, what was the reason that Texas Tech had a really big season, I think they'd bring up his name sooner rather than later.
Kevin, I saw a note last night that teams ranked outside, unranked in the AP poll, unranked in the AP poll, are 34-34 against teams ranked inside the top 10. What does that say?
I think there's a lot of parity, and I think, we've said this for years, but I think you're starting to see the COVID year guys, right? You're seeing a lot of guys out there that have the fifth or in some cases even sixth year. And so I do think the transfer portal causes some of it, and there's movement and all of those different things. But I think the other part of it is just the fact that you're seeing a lot of guys that have played an awful lot of basketball spread out throughout the country. And when you have that, you can't take a night off, and you can't look at a schedule and say, okay, here's the easy part of our schedule. We've got Houston and Baylor coming up next week, but this week it's only, at West Virginia or at UCF. You can't do that because even those teams that are struggling, they have some guys that have played a lot of basketball. I think one of the reasons Oklahoma State struggles so much is just their pure youth that they have and compared to everybody else. But you look at that UCF roster, you look at that Cincinnati roster, you look at BYU roster, there are a lot of guys that have played and started a lot of basketball games, have played in a lot of games. And so even teams that are able to pick up talent in maybe more traditional ways, you're having to deal with that whole experience factor. Everybody's got it. That whole get old and stay old goal, it's very realistic, and it's not just realistic to the top part of college basketball.
Kevin, can you explain Oklahoma to me? They're, to me, the toughest team outside of maybe Texas, who makes no sense that they should be way better than they are. But Oklahoma, I just cannot get a read on them. Like, how good are they? I know they're a good team, but I don't know how good they really are.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think they're so well coached. And I think when you go back and watch Oklahoma on tape, you see a number of baskets every game that they're generating because the offense is generating the baskets rather than the players are generating the baskets. And I think defensively, obviously, Porter Moser is a tremendous coach. I still think they're maybe a little bit on the under-talented side when it comes to comparing them to the top half, say, of the Big 12. And I'm a huge Javian McCollum fan. I like Otega-Oweh a lot. I think they have some interesting pieces there, but I think that they're in a spot maybe more than a lot of other people in that Baylor is so talented that every once in a while you're going to score because Jacoby Walter just gets you a basket, right? Or Ray J. Dennis has old man at the Y game, and goes and is able to score. And Oklahoma doesn't have that as much. As much as I like McCollum, there's a lot of pressure on him to generate for other guys. And I think when Oklahoma doesn't execute, it looks really, really bad. I don't know that they have guys that are super capable of going out there and kind of making a moment happen on their own. And I think that's part of the problem with them is they have to execute at such a high level. And when they don't, they're going to look pretty bad.
Kevin, Baylor blew out Oklahoma last night, and my goodness, Jaden Nunn was great. He really was. But do they go as far as Jacoby Walter if he locks in as the alpha, or do they need him to be an alpha?
I don't know if they need him to be an alpha. I think there are a lot of interesting questions around Baylor. I think, for one thing, we talked about Ray J. I think Ray J is such a fascinating fit with this Baylor team because I think Ray J is very deliberate in a lot of the things that he does. And I think that this is a Baylor team that outside of Ray J. Dennis really is probably at its best when they can get out and run, right? You look at how good Jacoby Walter is in transition. I mean, I don't know of a whole lot of centers out there that run the way that Misi does. And so, it's a little bit of not quite maybe a hand-in-glove fit, and that's not taking anything away from him. He's a really good player, and he does some great things. I think that's part of the question. I think you're not sure on a night-to-night basis what you're going to get from Missy. I call him Hurricane Eves because he's a guy that, you'll notice for the wrong reason or, you won't notice him at all for a stretch, and then all of a sudden – he'll have 6 points and 5 rebounds in 2 minutes and, block 2 shots. And you say, my gosh, this guy's the most talented guy in the Big 12. And so, I think they've got players like Jacoby Walter and like Missy that can go in and change games with, sort of individual talent and individual brilliance. I don't know that it needs to be Walter consistently. I do think they need him to show up consistently. But I think that, obviously when you look at last night's game, gosh, how good would Baylor be if Jaden Nunn was anywhere approaching that on a night-to-night basis? Mm-hmm. But I think they can do it as a team. I think they can be, hey, this guy gets 15 tonight, this guy gets 15 tomorrow night. But I do think that if they're going to go a long way in March, they probably need to have some moments of brilliance from the two freshmen.
Well, you're right. And Misi, goodness, just dripping with what looks like amazing talent for now and also into the future. Now, their guards, Dennis, Nunn, Walter, they're very, very erratic with ball control. I mean, they turn it over like 17 turnovers of 21 or whatever against Kansas on the road, and they almost still had a chance. They did have 2 chances to tie the game. Is that just who they are? Because last night I think they had just 5. I don't know if that's saying something about Oklahoma's defense or they tightened it up or what.
Well, and, Ray J over his career has typically protected the ball really well. That was a big part of who he was coming into Baylor. And so I don't know that it's necessarily who they are. I do think there are, kind of lapses in concentration, if you will, without knowing the locker room a ton. I know that this guy wasn't perfect either, but I don't know that there's a Mark Vidal who scares everybody within a 50-foot radius of him. Like if you make a mistake, I don't know that they necessarily have that guy. Obviously missing Langston Love, you wind up not having that extra option to go to. I think Miro Little, a lot of people maybe expected a little bit more from him at this point as well. And so that hurts too, because you can't look at a guy when he has a sloppy turnover or a couple turnovers or whatever. You can't look at him and say, okay, you're out of the game. We're just going to replace you with this other guy when the replacement isn't there. And so I do think they need to hone in on the focus a little bit, but I do think, Ray J. Dennis in particular is really capable of taking care of the basketball. And so that's something to watch for the final month or so, though.
All right, if you don't mind, I need to ask you about something. Obviously, you had the news earlier this week about what was going on with 247. You and I traded some text messages about this. I said a lot of people have reached out to you. You're really good at what you do, and I hope that when people have a chance, whoever it might be, to listen to this segment or any segment you've been on with us and want to have you on in the future, obviously it's been a really hard week for you because 800 people or so were laid off this week. Have you had anybody reach out to you? And if not, we need to figure that out.
I've had a few people reach out to me. I appreciate that. Yeah, it was a tough day yesterday. I think it's unfortunately something that's become a lot more commonplace in media. And quite frankly, I had been a part of 3 or 4 different newspapers or different media entities that went through layoffs where I was safe. And, I was kind of telling my wife that, it was sort of my turn, so to speak. You don't expect, I don't think, anymore to make it through and not get laid off, at some part. It's part of the journey. And so I appreciate the praise and everything. A few people have reached out, but it was certainly a tough day, and some talented colleagues are going to be out there on the market as well. If
something does hit, let me know. We'd like to continue to get you on throughout the rest of the basketball season. Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it, and good luck.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Kevin Flaherty, 247 CBS Sports college basketball writer. So